Final Fantasy has always been and is still currently the juggernaut of JRPGs throughout its lifespan. Even if you're not a fan of RPGs in general, there is a very high chance that you may have heard of its title several times because it is such a household name. I mean, the franchise has like 16 main entries, and don't even get me started on its spin-offs. But for today's video, I will be focusing on its latest entry. I'm going to start right from the gate and let you know that 16 does not play like your standard RPG. What an RPG normally consists of is wide open maps, towns and dungeons that you will need to visit throughout your journey, and recruiting an interesting cast of characters you'll need to micromanage and figure out their skill set in order to pilot them properly so you can gain the best results in each encounter. 16, however, takes all of these aspects and chops those in half, following a formula that feels more like an adventure style hack and slash. Basically, what would happen if Dante was just chilling one day and he gets isekai'd into a different world where he pretty much functions the same, but now he has some RPG mechanics to play with. Instead of playing through the game from one major story beat to the next by either exploring or going through a journey, 16's main campaign is broken up into stages which are disguised as chapters. And depending on the chapter, the player will have to navigate through 3 different types of zones. Wide open spaces which the players can explore for items, treasure chests, and battle monsters that appear out in the open, towns where the player can stock up on supplies or fortify their equipment, as well as picking up side quests, and dungeons which are chapter exclusives and can only be revisited through the game's arcade system. I will touch up on what that is later on. You generally start by picking these locations from the world map, which can be opened up at any time, and more of these locations will be made available to you as you progress from chapter to chapter. Of course, depending on where you are in the story, some of these areas will be blocked off, which is a typical thing that happens in RPGs no matter what type it is. Throughout your entire journey, you will be in control of Clive, who is the main protagonist of the game. And while you do get other characters that will join your party, they're more like extra bodies that will fight alongside you while you are in full control of Clive the entire time, especially since you don't have to worry about optimizing their gear or abilities for that matter. No disrespect to the lovely characters that will fight alongside you. But hey, you'll be accompanied by the best boy you can actually pet, and who doesn't want that? When you're running around in towns, you'll be able to talk to the locals for some extra information, shop at the stores, craft gear with the materials you earn from side quests or hunting monsters as I mentioned earlier, and even take on some bounties from the bounty board. Any combat abilities you have will be locked, so you won't be able to just swing your sword at anyone. Also, when you're walking around towns, they don't exactly feel empty or robotic either. NPCs will say various things as you walk past them, and those who can speak with you will have dialogue that matches the current state of the story.
Odin and Bahamut had at it by all accounts. Not by Belinus Tor.
Gods, it's a wonder we didn't feel it here.
It's always a nice touch to see how these NPCs will change based on current events instead of just saying random dialogue that doesn't fit the situation at all. Once you're out in the combative field, the controls will adapt to that environment. These fields is where all of the fighting, side quests, and optional exploration will take place, as these maps are generally larger and made with these actions in mind. When you're running around out here, Clive has access to his combat abilities, but I should point out that a number of his movement options, which are more fluid when he's fighting, will have a lot of end lag. This was definitely done to prevent players from moving around the fields too quickly, but honestly, I say they should have allowed it. Outside of his sprint, which will activate automatically after moving in the same direction for a few seconds, Clive's normal running speed, if we can call it that, is pretty sluggish. And unfortunately, he doesn't always have the ability to sprint in every combat area. A patch that will allow Clive to run pretty much anywhere, or at the very least allow us to spam our movement options with no end lag, would immediately fix this problem. Anyway, Clive has a 4-piece combo attack with his sword, and a magic attack which can be fired repeatedly on its own, or used right after any melee attack for a magic burst, which can turn your 4-piece into an 8-piece. And when I say any melee attack, I really do mean this, as magic bursting can be performed after using any of Clive's other sword attacks outside of its basic one. I should mention that magic bursting also requires timing, as the buttons must be pressed immediately after Clive swings his sword, otherwise the burst won't come out at all. When he is attacking enemies in the air, Clive can also perform up to 3 hits, which can be expanded to 6 if the player is making full use of the magic burst. His moveset can be expanded upon by visiting the skill tree and spending your ability points on them, which are earned through battles or questing, and a lot of these additional attacks are inexpensive too, so you can pretty much get all of your main sword upgrades pretty early. Clive also has access to 2 defensive options in the form of dodging and parrying. Dodging is as simple as it gets, as it allows Clive to step out of the way from enemy attacks, but if the player happens to time their dodge just as an attack is about to land, Clive will perform a precision dodge, which will cause time to briefly slow down as Clive moves out of the way with style. If you happen to press the attack or magic buttons during this animation, he'll perform what's called a precision counter or shot, which mechanically does the same thing, rewarding the player with a higher damaging attack. The biggest difference between them is that you can counter enemies from further away with the latter. As for parrying, this is performed when the player manages to strike an enemy with a melee attack just as they're in the middle of performing theirs. Parrying not only nullifies all of the damage, but it also slows down time for a longer period than a precision dodge, allowing the player to get some additional hits that will deal even more damage than before. Now, I will tell you that parrying is a lot harder to do than a precision dodge, and most of the time if I were to pull this off, it's purely by accident. But it is also very rewarding if you are able to get comfortable with it. Then you have your icons. Throughout the game, Clive will unlock additional moves and special attacks based on the icons he has equipped, and just so you are aware, the icons are pretty much this game's versions of the summons that have reappeared throughout the whole franchise. Clive can only equip up to 3 of these and can switch between them in combat. Each of these icons provide Clive with 2 iconic abilities which will go on cooldown when they're used, and an iconic feat which can be used at any time, like the phase shift he gets from the Phoenix. Additionally, each icon offers 2 more special attacks that Clive can learn from their skill trees, and mastering them will allow Clive to equip them even if he doesn't have their respective icon active at the time. This allows the player to customize their special attack slots however they see fit, given they have enough ability points to do so. One other thing I will point out is that despite this game taking place in the world of Final Fantasy, your magic attacks and iconic abilities will have absolutely no additional effects on the enemies you face. What I mean by this is that you don't need to worry about elemental weaknesses or resistances when using any of your magic or icon based moves, which isn't the first time a Final Fantasy game has done this. I mean, the spellcasters have no issues blowing everything up in 14 because they don't need to worry about that. Finally, you have your limit break, which will cause Clive to change to his semi-primordial form, which is more or less the devil trigger in this game. Your limit break meter fills up each time you're taking damage or dishing it out yourself. Once you have enough, pressing the L3 and R3 buttons will allow Clive to change into his semi-primordial form, giving all of his attacks a boost in terms of its damage output and providing additional hits while they're active. It will also passively recover Clive's HP, which is useful when you're low on health and can get you out of a pinch. If you press the L3 and R3 buttons while your limit break is active, Clive will return to normal, which is great for preserving your limit break meter for later use in longer battles. There's a few more things I need to mention in terms of Clive's controls during combat. You can lock on to enemies in this game similar to how things are handled in Kingdom Hearts, which is useful for keeping track of your targets when you're fighting multiple foes, and the game will also display a yellow indicator to warn you when an enemy is about to strike. Although I will admit that it does not always happen and it can be inconsistent at times. You can also use both your items and control Torgal's action with the control of the D-pad, and switch between them anytime you hit left on the D-pad button. Torgal in particular will always have access to 3 different moves, which is Sick, Heal, and Ravage. Sick will command Torgal to attack an enemy, which will change if the enemy is grounded or airborne. While in the air, he'll perform a multi-hitting spin dash, which is great for following up with your own combo. His Ravage will knock enemies into the air for you, which leads to more air combos, and if they're already airborne, he will just slap him right back down. Then there's his Heal, which will passively recover your health over time, but only recovering up to a certain amount of health you lost, which is indicated on the grayed out portion of your health bar. Torgal's abilities will also level up if you continue to command him, so it's heavily encouraged to do so as early as you can. Now, I have a word of advice. Before you really get into this game, I would suggest you play around with the control options and pick your type, because you cannot remap the buttons outside of the 6 control types that the game offers you. Then, once you figure out a control type to your liking, stick with that from the get-go. But if you want me to simplify the styles that may help with the experimenting, Types D and F have more of a traditional control scheme for those who played a lot of Devil May Cry and Kingdom Hearts. B and E are going to be a bit more friendly towards Soul players, assuming they stuck with the default controls for those games. And finally, A and C is for those who do not exactly have a control scheme in mind and just want to dive into the game as is. Now, the enemies you fight in 16 are plentiful and will come in all different shapes, sizes, and species, but they can be broken down into two different groups. There are the enemy grunts you can knock around like ragdolls, which are all pretty easy to take down, and generally these guys will attack in groups. Meanwhile, you have the larger enemies that don't flinch nearly as often and require more effort along with some level of finesse to get the job done. You can easily tell which foe you're dealing with at the time by taking a note of the yellow bar that's sitting right under their health. That is the stagger meter, which is exclusive only to the tougher enemies and of course, the bosses. Anytime you strike these enemies with your melee and magic attacks along with your icon abilities, that stagger meter will continue to deplete. Knock them down about halfway and the enemy will stagger for a brief period and it'll boost your damage output. Fully depleting that meter will stagger them outright and they will remain prone until the meter fills back up. During this time, all of your damage will be boosted, which is the perfect time to use up Clive's limit break, his hardest hitting icon attacks, or cashing out with the longest combo you can muster. You can deplete this meter even faster if you land precision counters, shots, and attack them after they have been parried. So learning the attack patterns of tougher foes and mastering your defensive options are heavily encouraged for this reasoning. While I am on the subject, let me talk about the bosses in this game. Bosses in 16 are highly engaging and very often feel like you're in an intense battle with a powerful foe. The game will make sure that you take your time to learn their moves, attack patterns, and behavior before you can attempt to make your own. Even when their attacks are telegraphed, they will keep you on your toes the entire battle and will punish you greatly if you're caught lacking out here. There are some battles I've had where I just didn't bother trying to go for a precision dodge or a parry because the risk will often lead to your health dropping to 0 depending on how heavy the attack hits. And I will warn you right now, there isn't a single boss in the game that will pull their punches. Sometimes during these battles, you will engage in cinematic fights where you're more or less performing quick time events, which are stuff we've seen in over-the-top games like Bayonetta, and for the type of game Final Fantasy XVI is trying to be, those QTEs definitely fit here. However, these QuickTime events are a double-edged sword to me. On one end, when they do come up during fights with high intensity, that is where they shine the most, and they don't show up too much to the point where it outright feels like the control is being taken away from me. On the other hand, one of these QuickTime prompts have 0 chance of failure even if the player doesn't do a thing. I'm going to tell you right now, the only QuickTime events that matter is when you are required to attack or dodge something that the enemy is doing. But when you are required to mash the square button, you really don't need to do that. If you don't press a thing, even for a long period of time, the game will not penalize you at all and it will stay on that prompt until you do. Furthermore, you don't even need to mash square to get the results either. You can see for yourself that I'm just pressing square normally and this QTE will still register as if I was mashing. Knowing what I know now, it kind of takes out the intensity of some of these events, as I have to wonder why even have them in the game if there's no margin for failure in the first place. But like I said earlier, these events are few and far in between. You can encounter these ranked elite monsters known as Notorious Marks, which are pseudo-bosses, as these guys are just as strong as the real deal. The higher the rank, the tougher that fight will be, but of course the rewards are worth it if you want to craft the best gear the game has to offer. Some of these monsters were also taken directly from Final Fantasy XIV, and they're practically identical to their MMO counterparts, which is not surprising given that Yoshi P, the lead producer of Final Fantasy XIV, is also this game's head developer. Now these guys are elites for a reason, so if you end up feeling overwhelmed, don't feel so bad about running away. I overall like how the combat is handled in this game. Is it the same turn-based combat that the games have been known for? Not in the slightest. But if we're being fair here, Final Fantasy has been moving away from turn-based combat almost as early as 12. I say almost because while the game isn't full on action, it plays more like an MMO than anything else, but that's beside the point. The combat as described by the developers back when the game was first being showcased is designed for players to approach it however they see fit. If they want to go for those stylish combos that are harder to pull off, they can do that. If they want to rely more on attacks that are easier to execute and stick to a more practical method, they can do that too. The game won't make the player feel bad no matter which approach they use, as long as it gives them the results they want to achieve. Though I must point out that if you want to experience the game the way it was meant to be played, I would advise not using these accessories at all, unless you have a very solid reason for doing so, as these three items when working together will literally play the game for you. Players can progress through the game by completing the main quest that will be presented in the form of these red quest markers. Meanwhile, the green quest markers are the side quests, which are completely optional. And both of these will lead the player to where they need to go once they've started them up. Side quests will start off with their usual go here and do this, or go here and fetch me this item. But as more of the main story unfolds, these side quests will keep up with the current events and can get pretty dark before you even have a chance to prepare yourself. So basically you'll go from heading down to the field and looking for a particular item or a character, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's what I'm looking for. I can assure you these side quests are going to slap you with quite a number of moments like those. There are only a handful of RPGs where I've bothered with side quests, since most of them tend to be mundane with minimal payoff, and I only go out of my way to complete the ones that will be more beneficial, which is typically not until the mid to late phases of the game. But due to how 16's story is structured and the fact that these side quests will follow the game's darker tone, I look forward to doing pretty much all of them because I want to see how these things play out, mainly because these side quests further adds to the game's story as well as the character's development instead of being out of place like most RPGs will typically do.
Oh, and when you go crying to your mistress, tell her it was Leon who gave you the pounding. Alright, so you know one end of a picture from here. Get over here! Enough. Me.
Players can also visit the Arid Stone, which will allow them to replay story scenarios exactly as they were in Story Replay, or in the form of an arcade style setting where the player can show off their combat prowess and the game will grade you based on how well you perform. Stage Replay is great for not only reliving your favorite moments, but it's also used to pick up any hidden treasures you might have missed during your first time and trying to hone your skills against enemies you face. You also gain experience and ability points while you're here, but keep in mind that they will be reduced. This mode is also perfect for any cutscenes you might have missed, so if you want to go ahead and see a cutscene during a certain moment in the game, here's a way that you're able to do it. Meanwhile, the arcade mode will reduce Clive's level down to where it should be during that particular stage, but any equipment Clive has on him as well as the icons he's acquired will remain intact. Like I said earlier, the sole purpose of this mode is to grade the player on how well they can perform in these stages, so any experiences or items that you find won't stay with you at all. They even have a training mode for you to brush up on your fighting abilities should you ever want to practice your combos or experiment with different builds to your liking. And this even gives you the option to set up different enemies to train against so you may learn their behaviors at your own leisure. Now it goes without saying that Final Fantasy XVI is a gorgeous game, a topic I will be coming back to later on in this video, but what really solidifies the immersion is the amount of quality that was put in the overall subject of sound. Not only the voice work for this game is some of the best I've heard in this series, but the amount of effort that was put into all of the sound effects you would hear throughout your environment is solid. This is enhanced even further when the effects are also coming out of the DualSense controller, which is saying a lot because I normally turn that feature off. With the combination of the speakers and the DualSense controller working together, I found myself becoming fully immersed in their world. I absolutely love using the element of fire, mainly because the sound quality that was put into the explosions is very satisfying to hear, while I am also giving my enemies a real taste of steel.
Over here. Stay down.
Of course I can't bring up the sound quality without mentioning the soundtrack. Say what you will about Final Fantasy titles, but one thing they are all guaranteed to have in common is that the music will always shine no matter what game you are playing. The music used in 16 will always match the tone of its current situation, doing its job in keeping the player immersed while the game is putting you through such an emotional journey. When things are about to hit the fan, the music will accompany this by playing a haunting tune as you wait with bated breath to see how bad the upcoming event is is going to turn out. In the heat of combat, especially during these intense battles, the music will shift to a theme that will match that level of intensity, keeping you locked into combat the entire time. This is why no matter what type of RPG you are playing, whether it's action, turn-based, or strategy, your music needs to be on point, and Final Fantasy XVI did not forget this rule. Now, you may have noticed that I had not talked about the game story at all. That is because, unlike my other videos, I really don't want to spoil a thing in regards of this game's overall plot. All I can tell you is that from my own experience when playing through the main story, Final Fantasy XVI is a game that you will want to start from the beginning to end without knowing too much of anything. When I went into this game, the only thing I knew about it at the time was just the battle system and the fact that you gain powers based on the summons themselves. And you know what? I'm glad that I did. Kazuo Toyomehiro and Yoshi P had worked together to deliver a story that is not only far more satisfying than the train wreck that is Final Fantasy XV, but is also one of the most darkest stories I've ever seen in a Final Fantasy game, period. These games have dived into dark content before, with Final Fantasy VI immediately coming to mind, but 16 outright ripped the kid gloves off and went ham with all the dark elements the story is going to throw at you. Each time I've completed a chapter, the game left me with wanting more out of the story. I was not only invested in seeing how Clive will overcome his hardships, which is an understatement, but I was eagerly waiting to see what would happen to everyone else while hoping that my favorite characters had enough plot armor to avoid getting the axe. The ride Final Fantasy XVI story put me through was definitely worth the wait, and it's for this reason I will not go into a plot synopsis. But I will warn you that this story is not for the faint of heart. So if you've got a problem with handling darker story tones, I advise that you proceed with an area of caution. Before I leave this topic on the game story, I want to point out a really cool feature 16 implemented that players can access at any time called the Active Time Lore. Anytime a player hits the touchpad on the controller during a cutscene, players can access a small reference menu that will give you a bit more detail on certain characters, locations, and whatnot. And this feature comes in handy should you decide to step away from the game for a hot minute and need a reminder on certain things so you don't miss out on impactful moments that the story is trying to set up. When you have a game that is going to be very heavy on its storytelling, this feature will save you a lot of trouble should you ever get lost or just need a better explanation if it ever calls for it. I can name plenty of other RPG titles that would definitely benefit from this useful feature. In any case, this is all I will say in regards of the game's story. If there's anything else I must point out that the game needs to improve on, one thing I need to talk about first is the camera angles during combat. While I found the combat experience to be fluid and responsive, one big issue I had is with the camera angles when you are fighting inside of smaller spaces. On a wide open map with plenty of space to work with, the camera will hardly get in the way, and it does a fine job keeping all of the important pieces on screen at all times, which is mainly Clive and whoever you're locked onto. But once you are fighting inside of a room where the field is much smaller, the camera will have the tendency to get stuck behind walls and various objects that make it difficult to not only keep up with your target, but also with your own movements. While it doesn't happen every time in closed spaces, it happens enough to a point where it can be annoying. Then there is also the game's performance. The footage you are seeing right now has been recorded off of the PS5 version, which as of now is exclusively on this system, at least until the 6-month period is up. When given the option, I will always play my PS5 games in performance mode, which will always give me that smooth, buttery frame rate that I can't get enough of, and I will never sacrifice that over highly intensive visuals, which I will say right now, the game is gorgeous regardless of what setting you put it on. With that being said, 16 does run with that smooth, buttery frame rate in performance mode when it wants to. There are moments throughout the game where the frames are going to drop, which tends to happen in wide open areas or during fights where there is a lot going on. Thankfully in my case, the frame rate drops aren't too much of a hindrance to outright disrupt my experience with the game, as the lowest I've seen mine go is roughly between 40 to 30 frames, but I'm aware that this can be a bother to other players who want to have a consistent frame rate. Now, if the frame rate dropped low enough to a point where I've entered Choppy City, I would definitely be singing a different tune, but thankfully, this is not the case. On the other side of the coin, the graphic mode is much clearer and is an eye candy to look at, especially in open areas and the villages in the game, although, like the performance mode, there will be times where frame rates will drop and you may see a graphical bug here or there. But unlike certain games that frequently have these issues, it isn't that bothersome. Then there's the fact that the RPG elements do take a back seat here. Now I should start by saying that just because the RPG elements does not have as strong of an impact here as other games that are under its belt, that does not mean that the game is bad. However, as an RPG enthusiast, I can understand why this would bother those who play these games for that reason. As I mentioned earlier, your magic and icons have no elemental influence whatsoever. Furthermore, players don't need to concern themselves with status manipulation such as buffs and debuffs outside of the potions, which serve to increase Clive's attack power or his defense. While it was designed this way so players don't need to concern themselves with these elements during its fast-paced combat, it does take away some of the reward you get from experimenting with different builds, as the combat loop can be summarized like this. Beat the snot out of them while using precision dodging and parrying to mitigate damage, break down their stagger meter if they have one, then cash out on all of your hardest hitting moves once the enemy is staggered, then rinse and repeat until they are finished. But this flaw is outweighed by the amount of variety the game provides its players on how they want to accomplish that goal. With different iconic abilities and feats at your disposal to customize to your liking, the fights themselves never felt dull even after I realized what the combat loop really is. Every game has a loop of some sort, it just really boggles down to how well the developers can engage their players in that loop while experiencing as little tedium as possible. While I am on the subject of this lack of RPG stuff, let's talk about that for a moment. I've seen a lot of people say that this game does not have any RPG elements or it's outright not an RPG at all, and to say any of that is an over-exaggeration. Not every RPG needs to have those moments where you have to make choices that impact the story in some way, especially the action-oriented ones. Games within the Atelier series or the Yeast titles didn't have any of these for the longest time, yet you don't see anyone flipping their lid over that. Final Fantasy XVI still has a decent chunk of RPG mechanics that will impact your gameplay in some way if you're not paying attention to them. Take your gear for example. Despite the game playing more like a hack and slash, gear still plays a heavy role in this game as it will determine how much damage you'll deal, as well as how often you can stagger your enemies. Plus, it directly influences Clive's stats as leveling up will only do so much by itself. Just to prove my point, I replayed one of the earlier stages in story replay mode, and I'm fighting these enemies without any of my gear on, plus my current level at the time is 37. Despite the enemies being 20 levels lower than my character, it feels like we're all around the same weight class because I don't have any of my gear on. Even when I'm using my iconic abilities and feats, which is another good source of high damage output, the fight still feels pretty even overall. But the moment I put my gear back on and replayed the same exact level, I tore through all of these enemies here as if they were melted butter. I could go a little deeper and talk more about these other aspects that are considered RPG mechanics in the game, but the point of the whole thing is that the RPG mechanics, while they are fewer, are still present in this game. All in all, Final Fantasy XVI isn't just a game, it is a whole experience. The game has been getting some flack for not sticking to its roots as a turn-based game and following a more traditional flow for its game progression, and instead opting for more of an action, linear arcade type of deal, sacrificing its RPG roots in the process. As I've pointed out before, the Final Fantasy games have been steering further away from turn-based combat with almost every entry after 11, 13 being an exception to that. Plus, it's not like Square has outright abandoned turn-based games or more traditional RPGs for that matter. Dragon's Quest is an RPG that has stuck to its roots forever, with 11 main entries under its belt, and Bravely Default has been doing a solid job keeping the spirit of Final Fantasy's more traditional style intact. Final Fantasy has always been an RPG franchise that tries to evolve its series as the times change, and this was evident the moment Final Fantasy VII dropped back on the PlayStation, which is the game that really caused the series to skyrocket into popularity in the first place. Now, I'm not saying Final Fantasy will never go back to its turn-based roots or completely abandon all of the RPG elements it was known for. We don't know what Square plans on doing with the franchise as they continue to produce more entries down the line. But what I can tell you is that Final Fantasy XVI is a solid entry, and I look forward to seeing how they will continue to advance the series as time moves on. Anyway, we've reached the end of the video. If you like what you saw, please like the video, hit me with that sickety sub, and comment down below on what your favorite Final Fantasy title is. Whether it's mainline or spin-offs, go on and list them anyway, as many as you like. Just in case you were curious, mine happens to be 6, both versions of 7, 9, 10, and I'm gladly adding 16 to that roster. Anyway, I hope I see y'all in the next one. Later!